Commander Zektar of the Vorthak Empire stood before the holographic display, his forearms crossed in a gesture that would have been intimidating to any lesser species. The Vorthak were known throughout the galaxy as apex predators, their homeworld a nightmare realm of eternal storms and creatures that could tear through starship hulls with their bare claws. For 3,000 years they had been the undisputed masters of warfare in this sector of space. But today, something had changed everything. The hologram showed a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Earth, they called it. The species that inhabited it called themselves humans, and by all accounts they should have been nothing more than another conquest for the Vorthak fleet. Their technology was primitive, their bodies soft and fragile, lacking even basic natural weapons like fangs or claws. When the Vorthak scouts had first reported on this species, the military council had laughed. That laughter had died quickly. 3 months ago, the hegemony of Sekthara had attempted to subjugate the human homeworld. The Sekthara were themselves a formidable species, known for their advanced plasma weapons and tactical brilliance. Their fleet of 200 vessels had approached Earth with confidence, broadcasting the standard surrender demands that had worked on countless other worlds. The humans had responded with a single transmission: no. What followed defied every military doctrine the galaxy had ever known. The humans didn't just fight back, they fought with a creativity and ruthlessness that shocked even the Vorthak observers. They turned their civilian infrastructure into weapons. Orbital stations became kinetic bombardment platforms. Mining ships transformed into improvised warships. Even their children participated, coordinating supply lines and information networks with efficiency that impressed hardened military analysts. But it wasn't just their adaptability that caught galactic attention. It was their refusal to surrender, even when facing impossible odds. Zektar had watched the recordings dozens of times. Human ships, crippled and burning, would ram themselves into Sekthara dreadnoughts rather than retreat. Ground forces, cut off from supply lines, would continue fighting with improvised weapons made from debris. Civilian populations, instead of cowering, would coordinate resistance efforts that turned entire cities into death traps for occupying forces. The Sekthara, despite their superior technology and numbers, had been forced to withdraw after losing 60% of their fleet. The defeat had sent shockwaves through every major power in the galaxy. If the mighty Sekthara could be repelled by these primitive humans, what did that mean for everyone else? Zektar turned away from the hologram and addressed his aide, a younger Vorthak warrior named Grixtal. Have our intelligence reports been verified? Yes, Commander. The humans have spent the 3 months since the Sekthara withdrawal, retrofitting their entire system for war. Every asteroid has been converted into a weapons platform. Every civilian ship now carries military-grade armaments. They've even begun expanding beyond their system, establishing what they call defense networks in neighboring sectors. Defense networks, Zektar repeated, the words tasting strange in his mouth. In Vorthak culture, defense was a foreign concept. They had always believed that the best defense was overwhelming offense. Yet these humans had proven that even the most aggressive attackers could be stopped by those willing to sacrifice everything to protect what they valued. The implications were staggering. For millennia, galactic civilization had operated on a simple principle: the strong conquered the weak, and the weak submitted or perished. The humans had introduced a third option that no one had seriously considered before. The weak could become strong through sheer determination and sacrifice. Reports were already coming in from across the galaxy. Species that had lived in fear of larger empires were beginning to study human tactical manuals. Worlds that had accepted tributary status were quietly building defense networks of their own. The Keth Mori Collective, traditional allies of the Vorthak, had even begun implementing what they called human-style resistance protocols in their outer colonies. Grixtal shifted nervously, his tail lashing in agitation. Commander, the War Council is demanding action. They believe that if we don't strike at the humans now, while they're still technologically inferior, we may never get another chance. Zektar nodded slowly. The War Council was right in their way. Every day the humans continued to exist was another day for their infectious philosophy to spread. Already, 3 minor species had successfully repelled Vorthak raids using tactics clearly inspired by human military doctrine. If this trend continued, the entire galactic order could collapse. Yet something about the humans intrigued him. In all his years as a warrior, Zektar had never encountered a species that fought purely for the sake of those they loved, with no thought of conquest or expansion. The humans didn't seem interested in building an empire. They simply wanted to be left alone to pursue their own path among the stars. It was a concept so alien to Vorthak thinking that it almost seemed like insanity. Almost, but not quite. Because the results spoke for themselves. In 3 months, the humans had transformed from a backwater species into a force that had the entire galaxy talking. They hadn't done it through superior technology or ancient wisdom. They had done it through something even more powerful, the absolute refusal to kneel before anyone, no matter the cost. "Prepare the fleet," Zektar finally commanded. "We leave for the Sol system within the week." As Grixtal hurried away to carry out the order, Zektar remained alone with his thoughts. The Vorthak Empire had crushed 1,000 worlds, but they had never faced an enemy quite like humanity. These creatures fought not for glory or conquest, but for something the Vorthak had never truly understood: love. Love for their families, their home, their way of life. For the first time in his long military career, Commander Zektar found himself wondering if the Vorthak might have something to learn from their intended prey. The thought should have been heretical, but as he stared at the blue marble hanging in space on his display, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The galaxy had ruled through fear for millennia. The humans were about to teach them all a different way. Admiral Sarah Chen floated in the zero-gravity command center of humanity's newest orbital fortress, her eyes scanning the tactical displays that showed the approaching Vorthak fleet. 250 ships, each one capable of reducing a continent to ash. The intelligence reports had been clear. This wasn't just another raid or conquest attempt. This was total war, the kind the Vorthak had perfected over 3 millennia of galactic domination. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she had been a freight coordinator for the Luna Mining Consortium, her biggest worry being shipping schedules and cargo manifests. The Sekthora invasion had changed everything. When the call went out for experienced space personnel to help coordinate Earth's defense, Sarah had volunteered alongside millions of others. Her logistics background had proven invaluable in the frantic months of preparation that followed. Now she wore the uniform of the hastily formed Earth Defense Force, commanding a fleet that existed only because humanity had learned to turn necessity into innovation. Every ship under her command had been a civilian vessel just months ago. Cargo haulers retrofitted with railguns, passenger liners converted into mobile command centers, mining ships equipped with kinetic bombardment systems that could crack asteroids or enemy hulls with equal efficiency. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the Vorthak fleet," reported Lieutenant Commander Jackson, a former merchant marine who had adapted to military protocol with the same determination that defined their entire species. "They're demanding our immediate surrender," Sarah almost smiled. The same demand, the same assumption that they would simply roll over and accept subjugation. After the Sekthara War, humanity had studied every major galactic power extensively. The Vorthak were the worst of them all, a species that viewed mercy as weakness and conquest as the natural order of the universe. They had enslaved or destroyed over 2,000 civilizations, turning entire star systems into industrial complexes to feed their war machine. "Put me through to all ships," Sarah commanded. The communication array crackled to life, connecting her to the 300 vessels scattered throughout the Sol system. Not just military ships, but civilian craft as well. Families who had refused evacuation, choosing instead to stand and fight alongside the official defense forces. It was madness by any logical standard, but logic had stopped applying the moment humanity decided it would rather die free than live in chains. "This is Admiral Chen to all vessels. You've all seen the reports on the Vorthak. You know what they've done to other worlds. They expect us to surrender because that's what everyone else has done for 3,000 years. But we're not everyone else." She paused, thinking of her own family safe in the underground cities of Mars, and of the billions of humans who had trusted her and others like her to hold the line. "They think we're just another primitive species that can be bullied into submission. They're about to learn why that's the biggest mistake they've ever made." The response came not in words but in actions. Across the solar system, human ships began moving into position. It wasn't the orderly formation that traditional military doctrine would have demanded. Instead, it was something uniquely human. Organized chaos that made perfect sense to those who understood that sometimes the best way to win was to fight in ways your enemy couldn't predict. Mining, Platforms in the asteroid belt powered up their industrial lasers, repurposed for ship-to-ship combat. Orbital habitats around Jupiter launched swarms of maintenance drones, each one carrying enough explosive material to cripple a Vorthak destroyer. Even the generation ships heading to Alpha Centauri had turned around, their fusion drives making them effective kinetic weapons despite their peaceful origin. But the real surprise was waiting in the outer system, hidden in the shadow of Pluto. 3 months of around-the-clock construction had produced humanity's first true war machine, the Terra Invicta, a ship built from the ground up for one purpose. It wasn't elegant like the sleek vessels of other species. It was brutal and functional, bristling with weapons that combined human innovation with captured Sekthara technology. More importantly, it represented something that no galactic power had seen in millennia, a ship built not for conquest, but for protection. The Vorthak fleet entered the outer solar system with the confidence that came from 3,000 years of unopposed victory. Their battle formation was flawless, their approach methodical and overwhelming. They had done this countless times before, and they expected the same result: a brief, brutal demonstration of superior firepower followed by either surrender or extinction. Commander Zektar watched the human positions from his flagship's command center, studying the scattered defensive arrangements with professional interest. It was clear that the humans had learned from the Sekthara conflict, but their response still seemed chaotic and unfocused. They had spread their forces too thin, trying to defend everything instead of concentrating on what mattered most. It was a rookie mistake that would cost them dearly. "Begin the assault," he ordered. "Primary targets are the orbital fortresses around Earth. Secondary targets are the asteroid mining platforms. Leave the civilian habitats for last. I want them to watch their military forces be destroyed before we offer them one final chance to surrender." The Vorthak attack began with a coordinated barrage from their heavy cruisers, plasma bolts designed to overwhelm human shields and armor. It was a tactic that had worked on every species they had ever encountered, a demonstration of raw power that usually broke enemy morale before the real fighting even began. But the human response was unlike anything in the Vorthak military database. Instead of trying to weather the storm or mounting a conventional counterattack, the human ships simply moved, not retreating, but repositioning in ways that seemed random until the pattern became clear. They were using the solar system itself as a weapon, drawing the Vorthak fleet into positions where human advantages could be maximized. Sarah watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the first phase of humanity's defense unfolded exactly as planned. The Vorthak were powerful, but they were also predictable. Like every other galactic empire, they had become comfortable with their dominance, fighting the same battles in the same ways for so long that they had forgotten how to adapt. "Phase 2, she commanded. "Show them what humans do when we're fighting for everything we love." Across the solar system, the real battle was about to begin, and for the first time in 3 millennia, the Vorthak were about to discover what it meant to face an enemy that refused to play by the rules they had written in the blood of 1,000 worlds. The battle for Sul had been raging for 18 hours, and Commander Zektar was beginning to understand why the Sekthara had retreated. The humans didn't fight like any species he had ever encountered. They fought like the very laws of warfare meant nothing to them, turning every disadvantage into an unexpected strength. When the Vorthak fleet had moved to engage the asteroid belt mining platforms, the humans had turned the entire belt into a maze of death. Mining charges, originally designed to fracture asteroids, became devastating mines that could cripple a battleship. Industrial equipment became improvised weapons that fired chunks of refined metal at relativistic speeds. Worst of all, the human miners themselves refused to evacuate, turning their familiar territory into a fortress that the Vorthak couldn't navigate without taking devastating losses. Zektar watched his tactical display with growing unease as another squadron of destroyers went dark in the belt. The human defenders weren't just using their technology creatively. They were coordinating in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Miners who had never seen military service were outmaneuvering veteran Vorthak pilots, using their intimate knowledge of local space to set ambushes that should have been impossible. "Sir, we're receiving reports from the Jupiter engagement," his communications officer announced. "The human defense platforms there they've somehow weaponized the planet's magnetic field." Zektar's 4 eyes widened in disbelief. "Explain." They're using the gas giant's magnetosphere to accelerate projectiles to incredible velocities. Our shields can't compensate for weapons traveling at that speed. 3 heavy cruisers have been destroyed, and Admiral Vexthul is requesting permission to withdraw from that sector. The request was unprecedented. In 3,000 years of warfare, no Vorthak admiral had ever requested permission to retreat from primitives. Yet here they were, being outfought by a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel a few centuries ago. But it wasn't just the tactical innovations that disturbed Zektar. It was the spirit behind them. The humans fought with a desperation and creativity that spoke of people who would rather die than submit. When their ships were disabled, the crews would ram them into Vorthak vessels rather than surrender. When their weapons failed, they improvised new ones from whatever materials they had available. When their formations were broken, they regrouped and attacked from directions that defied military logic. On his personal communication channel, Zektar received a priority message from the War Council back on the Vorthak homeworld. The contents made his blood run cold. 3 more species in distant sectors had successfully repelled Vorthak raids, using tactics clearly derived from human military doctrine. The Zalathi Confederation had actually launched a counterattack against Vorthak territory, something unthinkable just months ago. The human virus was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Every day the Sol system held out was another day for other species to study human methods, to learn that the galaxy's apex predators could be beaten by those willing to fight with absolute commitment to their cause. On board the Terra Invicta, Admiral Chen was coordinating the next phase of humanity's defense. The massive warship had remained hidden throughout the initial engagement, its stealth systems concealing it in the shadow of Pluto, while the Vorthak fleet exhausted itself against humanity's outer defenses. Now it was time for Earth's secret weapon to reveal itself. "All stations report ready, Admiral," reported her tactical officer, Commander Martinez, who had been an asteroid mining foreman before the war. Like everyone else in the human fleet, he had adapted to his new role with the flexibility that seemed to define their species. "Signal all civilian vessels to begin final evacuation protocols," Chen ordered, "and transmit our message to the Vorthak fleet." The message that went out to Commander Zektar was simple and direct, delivered in perfect Vorthak military protocol by a human linguist who had learned the language from captured Sekthara databases. "Commander Zektar of the Vorthak Empire, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Force. You have entered our system with the intent to conquer or destroy our civilization. We want you to know that we understand exactly what you represent and what you've done to other worlds. We also want you to know that we don't care. You will not pass." Zektar studied the transmission data and felt his warrior's heart skip a beat. The humans had known his name, his rank, even details of his military record that should have been classified. They had been studying the Vorthak as thoroughly as the Vorthak had been studying them. But more than that, they had declared their intention to fight to the last ship, the last soldier. "The last breath, sir," his sensor operator announced. "We're detecting a massive energy signature from the outer system. Something large is powering up." The Terra Invicta dropped its stealth field like a giant awakening from slumber. The ship was enormous even by Vorthak standards, but it wasn't its size that sent shockwaves through the enemy fleet. It was its design. Unlike the elegant curves and artistic flourishes that marked most galactic warships, the human vessel was pure function. Every surface bristled with weapons. Every angle was designed for maximum combat efficiency. It looked like it had been built by people who understood that war was ugly, brutal work, and had designed their ship accordingly. "All ships, new target priority," Zektar commanded, recognizing the threat immediately. "Concentrate fire on the human dreadnought. Maximum firepower." The Vorthak response was swift and devastating. 200 ships focused their weapons on the Terra Invicta, unleashing enough destructive power to glass a continent. Plasma bolts and particle beams converged on the human ship in a display of firepower that should have reduced it to cosmic dust in seconds. But the humans had learned from every previous engagement. The Terra Invicta's shields weren't just copied alien technology. They were something entirely new, combining Sekthara energy projection with human materials science and powered by fusion reactors that burned hotter than most stars. The ship shrugged off the initial barrage and returned fire with weapons that defied galactic military doctrine. Instead of the precise, targeted shots favored by most species, The humans fought like they were still throwing rocks at predators in some primordial struggle for survival. Their weapons were crude but devastatingly effective, designed not for elegance but for maximum destructive impact. Railguns fired projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. Missile swarms overwhelmed enemy point defenses through sheer numbers rather than sophistication. Energy weapons focused not on penetrating shields but on overloading them through brute force application. The effect on Vorthak morale was immediate and catastrophic. For 3,000 years, they had been the most feared military force in the galaxy, respected and terrified in equal measure. Now they found themselves trading shots with what amounted to an armed industrial accident, and they weren't winning. Commander Zektar watched his fleet's casualty reports with growing horror. In 18 hours of combat, they had lost more ships than in the previous 50 years of galactic conquest. The humans weren't just fighting them, they were teaching the entire galaxy that the mighty Vorthak Empire could bleed. And across the cosmos, other species were watching every moment of the battle, learning that the age of galactic empires built on fear and submission might finally be coming to an end. 3 days into the battle, something unprecedented happened in the galaxy. The Kethmori Collective, longtime allies of the Vorthak Empire, officially withdrew their support and declared neutrality. Within hours, similar announcements came from a dozen other species. The galactic order that had stood for millennia was cracking, and it was all because a small blue planet refused to kneel. Commander Zektar received the news aboard his flagship as human forces continued their impossible resistance. His fleet had been reduced to 60% of its original strength, while the humans seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. It wasn't just their tactical flexibility or innovative weapons. It was their refusal to accept defeat even when faced with overwhelming odds. The asteroid belt had become a graveyard of Vorthak ships, turned into twisted metal by miners who fought like demons possessed. The gas giants had been transformed into weapons platforms that used the very laws of physics against their attackers. Even Earth's moon had revealed hidden batteries of kinetic bombardment systems that could reach out and touch Vorthak vessels at impossible ranges, but it was the humans themselves that truly disturbed Zektar. In every previous conquest, there came a moment when the defending species realized they were beaten and began looking for ways to surrender with dignity and tact. The humans had passed that point days ago and simply kept fighting. Their casualties were enormous. Their infrastructure was being systematically destroyed, and yet their resistance only seemed to grow fiercer. "Sir, we're receiving a priority transmission from the War Council," his communications officer reported with obvious reluctance. The holographic image of High War Master Tekful materialized in the command center, his ancient scarred features twisted with rage. "Zektar, explain to me how a single primitive world has held off the finest fleet in the Vorthak Empire for 3 days. High Master, these humans fight unlike any species we've encountered. They've turned their entire solar system into a fortress, and they refuse to acknowledge when they're beaten. Every attempt to engage them conventionally results in heavy casualties for our forces." Tekeval's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you telling me that the Vorthak Empire, masters of 1,000 worlds, cannot defeat a single planet of primitives?" "High Master, they're not fighting like primitives. They're fighting like they have nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Their tactics are unpredictable because they don't follow galactic military doctrine. They innovate in real time, turning everything around them into weapons." The War Master's response was cut short by an urgent alert from the sensor station. "Sir, massive energy signatures throughout the system. The humans are powering up something big. Across the Sol system, humanity's final gambit was beginning. For 3 days, while their ships fought and died against the Vorthak fleet, human engineers had been working around the clock on a project that would have been considered insanity by any other species. They were going to turn their own sun into a weapon. Solar collection arrays that had powered human civilization for decades were being retrofitted with focusing equipment salvaged from mining operations. Magnetic field generators stripped from fusion reactors were being repurposed to channel stellar energy. Even damaged warships were being positioned to serve as relay stations, their crews volunteering for what amounted to suicide missions. Admiral Chen watched the preparations from the bridge of the Terra Invicta, her ship now scarred by dozens of battles but still fighting. The human flagship had become a symbol of their resistance, proof that determination could overcome technological superiority. But she knew that even human stubbornness had limits. Her fleet was down to less than 100 operational vessels, and Earth itself was under direct bombardment. "Admiral, all stations report ready for Operation Solar Flare," her tactical officer announced. Chen nodded grimly. The operation would tap into the sun's magnetic field and redirect a controlled solar storm directly at the Vorthak fleet. It was theoretically possible, but it had never been attempted on this scale. The margin for error was essentially zero, and failure would likely sterilize the entire inner solar system. "This is Admiral Chen to all human forces," she broadcast across the system. "In 30 seconds, we're going to attempt something that every textbook says is impossible. If we succeed, we'll prove to the galaxy that humans don't just survive against impossible odds. We make them work for us. If we fail, well, at least we'll fail as free people." She paused, thinking of all the worlds that had surrendered to forces like the Vorthak, all the species that had accepted chains rather than risk annihilation. Either way, we're about to show the galaxy what happens when you threaten everything humans hold dear. The solar arrays activated in perfect synchronization, their focusing fields reaching across 93 million miles to touch the surface of Sol itself. Magnetic bottle generators created a pathway through space, guiding stellar plasma and radiation into a coherent beam that would make any artificial weapon look like a child's. Toy Commander Zektar had only seconds to realize what the humans were attempting before the controlled solar storm struck his fleet. The energy release was beyond anything in Vorthak military experience. Ships that had weathered thousands of battles were vaporized instantly. Those that survived the initial blast found their systems overloaded by electromagnetic pulses that turned sophisticated electronics into useless scrap metal. In 15 seconds, the pride of the Vorthak Empire was reduced from 250 ships to fewer than 40. But even more devastating than the physical damage was the psychological impact. The humans hadn't just defeated them with superior technology or numbers. They had reached out and commanded their own star to fight for them. Across the galaxy, the news spread faster than light itself. The humans had done something that violated every assumption about primitive species. They had taken their most basic source of life and transformed it into the ultimate weapon of war. More importantly, they had proven that any species willing to fight with absolute commitment could find ways to defeat even the most overwhelming odds. The surviving Vorthak ships limped toward the edge of the system, their retreat covered by the few vessels still capable of combat. But the damage had been done. The myth of Vorthak invincibility was shattered, and with it the foundation of galactic order. On worlds throughout the cosmos, species that had lived in fear of the great empires began to hope. The humans had shown them something that no amount of technology could provide, the knowledge that freedom was worth any price, and that those willing to pay it could never truly be defeated. But the battle for Sol was far from over. The surviving Vorthak forces were already regrouping, and intelligence reports suggested that other empires were mobilizing fleets of their own. The humans had won an impossible victory, but in doing so, they had declared war on the established order of the entire galaxy. Admiral Chen studied the tactical displays as her battered fleet prepared for whatever came next. They had saved Earth, but now they faced an even greater challenge, surviving the wrath of every galactic power that understood the threat humanity represented to their way of life. The age of human defiance had only just begun. 6 months after the Battle of Sol, the galaxy was unrecognizable. What had started as a simple conquest attempt by the Vorthak Empire had triggered a cascade of revolts, declarations of independence, and military coups that shattered the established order across dozens of star systems. The Zalathi Confederation had been the first to openly adopt human military doctrine, successfully repelling not just Vorthak raids but launching their own liberation campaigns to free worlds under imperial control. The Kethmori Collective had gone even further, publicly announcing their intention to form a mutual defense pact with any species willing to fight for their independence. Commander Zektar, now demoted to mere ship captain after his failure at Sol, stood in the ruins of what had once been a Vorthak garrison on the industrial world of Terminus 7. The local population, inspired by human broadcasts that somehow reached every corner of the galaxy, had risen in revolt 3 weeks ago. Instead of the usual pattern of crushing resistance through overwhelming force, The Vorthak garrison had found itself fighting an enemy that used every trick humanity had demonstrated. Workers had turned mining equipment into weapons. Civilians had coordinated supply networks that kept rebels equipped, despite orbital blockades. Most disturbing of all, the local species had shown a willingness to sacrifice everything rather than return to Imperial control, fighting with a desperation that reminded Zektar uncomfortably of the humans themselves. "Sir," his aide reported, "the evacuation transports are ready. Command has ordered all remaining personnel to withdraw to the outer rim fortresses." Zektar nodded without taking his eyes off the burning city below. Terminus 7 was the 19th world they had been forced to abandon in the past 6 months. Each retreat sent the same message throughout the galaxy. The mighty Vorthak Empire could be beaten by any people willing to fight with human-style determination. 3,000 light-years away, Admiral Sarah Chen was dealing with problems of an entirely different nature. The success of humanity's defense had attracted attention from across the galaxy, but not all of it was welcome. Her communication array had been flooded for months with requests for military assistance, technological exchange, and defensive pacts. Every species that had ever suffered under Imperial rule wanted humanity as an ally, and they weren't always willing to take no for an answer. "Admiral, we're receiving another diplomatic mission from the Draconis Republic," her communications officer announced. "They're offering exclusive mining rights to 3 star systems in exchange for human military advisors." Chen sighed. It was the same pattern every day. Species that had never shown interest in human space were suddenly eager to form alliances, offer trade deals, and share intelligence about Imperial movements. The problem was that humanity barely had enough resources to rebuild their own defenses, let alone export their military doctrine to every corner of the galaxy. But the bigger issue was philosophical. The humans hadn't fought the Vorthak to become a new galactic superpower. They had fought for the right to be left alone, to choose their own path among the stars. Now they found themselves at the center of a growing revolution that threatened to consume the entire galactic civilization. "Schedule the Draconis delegation for next week," Chen decided, "and make sure they understand that any alliance will be based on mutual respect, not human dominance. We're not interested in replacing one empire with another." The sentiment was admirable, but events were already moving beyond human control. On the former Vorthak colony of New Sparta, a mixed population of refugees from a dozen species had declared independence and established what they called the Free Worlds Alliance. Their constitution, written by beings who had never set foot on Earth, was based entirely on human principles of individual liberty and collective defense. Similar movements were emerging throughout the galaxy. The Rigel Liberation Front had successfully driven Imperial forces from an entire sector using modified human tactics. The Centauri Defense League had turned their home system into a fortress that rivaled Sol itself. Even species that had been loyal Imperial subjects for millennia were beginning to question the wisdom of serving masters who could be defeated by determined resistance. The galactic empires were beginning to panic. Emergency sessions of the Imperial Council had been called 3 times in 6 months, each one resulting in increasingly desperate measures to contain what they termed the human contagion. Trade embargoes, communication blackouts, and preemptive strikes against potentially rebellious worlds had all failed to stop the spread of human-inspired resistance movements. High War Master Thekval convened a secret meeting of the galaxy's most powerful military leaders on a neutral world in the galactic core. Representatives from the hegemony of Sekthara, the tyrant worlds of Vex, and even the mysterious Shadow Fleet attended. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy's apex predators were acknowledging that they faced a common threat. "The human virus must be contained," Thekval announced to the assembled military commanders. "If we allow their philosophy to spread unchecked, it will destroy the order that has kept the galaxy stable for millennia." General Vexithara of the Sekithara spoke for many when she replied, "Containment has already failed. Half the galaxy is in revolt, and they're all using human tactics. The only solution is complete eradication of the human homeworld and everything connected to it." The debate that followed would have shocked any human observer. These beings, who had ruled through fear and force for thousands of years, were genuinely terrified by the idea of people who refused to be conquered. They understood intuitively that humanity represented something far more dangerous than any military technology. the proof that freedom was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. But even as the galactic empires planned their response, the revolution continued to spread. On Earth, human military academies worked around the clock to train officers from dozens of species in the art of defensive warfare. Human engineers shared their innovations freely with anyone willing to stand up to imperial oppression. Most importantly, human diplomats carried a simple message to every corner of the galaxy. You don't have to kneel to anyone. The message resonated because it spoke to something fundamental that existed in every sentient species: the desire to be free, to make their own choices, to protect what they loved without having to ask permission from distant masters. The galactic empires had suppressed this desire for millennia, but they had never eliminated it. The humans had simply reminded the galaxy that freedom was worth fighting for. Admiral Chen stood before the holographic display in her rebuilt command center, watching real-time reports of liberation movements across the galaxy. Each pinpoint of light represented a world in revolt, a species that had chosen freedom over security. The sight filled her with pride and terror in equal measure. The humans had never intended to spark a galactic revolution. They had simply refused to surrender when faced with extinction. But their example had shown countless others that the choice between freedom and slavery wasn't really a choice at all. Any species willing to pay the price could throw off the chains of imperial rule. The price, however, was becoming clearer every day. Intelligence reports indicated that the combined imperial fleets were massing for a final assault on Sol and its allies. Over 2,000 ships from a dozen different empires, representing the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. They weren't coming to conquer anymore. They were coming to make an example that would terrify any other species that might consider rebellion. "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the Free Worlds Alliance. They're requesting permission to send reinforcement fleets to Sol." Chen considered the offer carefully. In the 6 months since the Vorthak defeat, humanity had gained allies throughout the galaxy. Not subjects or vassals, but genuine partners who shared their commitment to freedom and self-determination. The Free Worlds Alliance alone could field nearly 300 ships, all crewed by beings who had learned that liberty was worth any sacrifice. "Grant permission," she decided, "and send our tactical database to all allied fleets. If we're going to face the entire galaxy's imperial forces, we're going to do it together." As she spoke, similar scenes were playing out across the cosmos. Species that had been enemies for millennia were setting aside ancient grudges to face a common threat. The revolution that humanity had started was no longer about any single world or people. It had become something larger. The fight to determine whether the galaxy would be ruled by fear or by hope. The final battle was coming, and its outcome would decide the fate of every sentient being in the galaxy. The empires had the numbers and the technology, but the revolutionaries had something more powerful: the unshakable belief that some things were worth dying for. And at the center of it all, a small blue planet waited to see if their impossible dream of freedom could survive the storm that was about to break upon them all. The largest fleet in galactic history dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, a wall of steel and death that stretched across light minutes of space. 2,300 ships from 17 different empires, their combined firepower capable of reducing entire star systems to cosmic dust. At their head flew the personal dreadnought of High War Master Thekval, its hull inscribed with the names of 1,000 conquered worlds. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a statement of intent that would echo across the galaxy for millennia to come. The Imperial forces had come to Sol not merely to destroy humanity, but to demonstrate what happened to species that dared inspire others to rebellion. Every ship in the fleet carried recording equipment to broadcast the coming slaughter to every corner of galactic civilization. "Admiral," Chen watched the enemy fleets approach from the bridge of the rebuilt Terra Invicta, now the flagship of the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. Around Earth's star, nearly 800 ships waited in defensive positions. Human vessels fought alongside Zalathi cruisers, Kethmori destroyers, and ships from dozens of other species that had answered the call to defend freedom itself. The sight should have been magnificent, but Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were vastly outgunned. The Imperial fleet represented the accumulated military might of civilizations that had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years. Against them stood a collection of rebels, refugees, and revolutionaries whose only advantage was their unwillingness to surrender. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the Imperial fleet," her communications officer announced. The holographic image of High War Master Thekval materialized in the command center. His ancient features twisted with rage and disgust. Behind him, Chen could see the bridges of other Imperial flagships, their commanders watching with expressions of cold anticipation. "Admiral Chen of the terrorist organization calling itself the Earth Defense Force," Thekval began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You stand accused of crimes against galactic order, sedition, and the promotion of anarchistic violence throughout civilized space. Your actions have resulted in the deaths of millions and the destruction of stability that has lasted for millennia." Chen listened without expression, noting how the War Master framed the conflict. To the empires, freedom itself was a crime against the natural order. The idea that beings could govern themselves without imperial oversight was so foreign to their thinking that they literally couldn't comprehend it as anything other than chaos and terrorism. "You will surrender immediately and submit to imperial justice," Thekval continued. "Your planet will be occupied, your military forces disbanded, and your population relocated to secure facilities where they can no longer spread their destructive ideology. Failure to comply will result in the complete sterilization of your solar system and the execution of every human being in known space." The ultimatum hung in the air for long moments, transmitted not just to Earth but to every allied world throughout the galaxy. Billions of beings who had thrown off imperial rule waited to hear humanity's response, knowing that it would determine the fate of their own freedom. Chen stood slowly, her uniform bearing the scars of a dozen battles fought for the right to make this moment possible. When she spoke, her voice carried across the galaxy with quiet determination that had become humanity's signature. "High War Master Thekval, I want to thank you for making our choice so clear. You've just explained to every watching world exactly what imperial rule means: submission or death, slavery or annihilation. You've shown the galaxy what we're really fighting against." She paused, looking directly into the camera that would carry her words to countless worlds. "To every being listening to this transmission, know that you have allies here. Know that freedom is possible, that you don't have to kneel to anyone, and that there are those willing to stand with you against any odds." Turning back to Thekval's image, Chen delivered humanity's final answer. "We reject your ultimatum. We deny your authority, and we will never surrender. Earth stands free, and we stand with all who choose freedom over chains." The transmission ended, and the greatest battle in galactic history began. The Imperial assault opened with a coordinated bombardment that lit up the solar system like a newborn star. Energy weapons capable of cracking planets focused their fury on the Allied defensive positions, while kinetic projectiles traveling at significant fractions of light speed turned space itself into a killing field. But the defenders had learned from every previous battle. Human innovation had spread throughout the Allied fleet, turning each ship into a unique threat that defied Imperial tactical doctrine. Salathi vessels used gravitic manipulation to bend enemy fire back on itself. Cathamori ships deployed swarms of nanoscale attackers that ate through Imperial hulls like acid. Former mining crews turned asteroid fragments into kinetic weapons that could punch through the heaviest armor. Most importantly, they fought with a coordination that came from shared purpose rather than imposed discipline. Every captain in the Allied fleet knew exactly what they were fighting for: the right to determine their own fate among the stars. It was a motivation that no amount of Imperial training could match. The battle raged across the entire solar system, from the outer planets to the asteroid belt, to Earth's own orbital space. Ships died by the dozens, their crews sacrificing themselves to protect not just their own worlds but the principle that freedom was worth any price. High War Master Thekval watched the engagement from his command center with growing disbelief. The Imperial fleet was winning, but not in the way they had expected. Every Allied ship they destroyed took Imperial vessels with it. Every position they captured was retaken by reinforcements that seemed to appear from nowhere. The rebels were losing, but they were making victory so costly that it felt like defeat. "Sir, casualty reports are coming in," his aide announced reluctantly. "We've lost over 400 ships, and Allied reinforcements continue to arrive from across the galaxy." Thekval's eyes widened. 400 ships was more than the Empire had lost in the previous century of conquest. The humans and their allies were fighting with such desperate determination that they were achieving kill ratios that should have been impossible. But more disturbing were the reports coming in from across the galaxy. On dozens of worlds, local populations were rising in revolt as they watched the battle for Sul. The Imperial fleet's own recording equipment was broadcasting, proof that the rebels could fight the combined might of the galaxy and make it bleed. Continue the assault, Thekval ordered. But for the first time in his long military career, he wasn't sure if victory was worth the price they were paying for it. The battle was far from over, but its true purpose was already being served. Regardless of who won or lost at Sol, the galaxy would never be the same. The age of unquestioned Imperial dominance was ending, and something new was being born in the fires of the greatest battle in galactic history. 7 hours into the Battle of Sol, the impossible happened. Admiral Chen received a priority transmission that changed everything. "Admiral, this is Captain Zektar of the Vorthak vessel Honor's Edge. I am requesting permission to join your defensive formation." The bridge fell silent. Every human officer stared at the communication panel as if it had malfunctioned. The idea of a Vorthak ship asking to fight alongside humans was so unprecedented that it took several seconds for anyone to respond. "Sir," Chen's communications officer whispered, "should I verify the transmission? This could be some kind of Imperial trick." But Chen was studying the tactical display, watching as a single Vorthak heavy cruiser broke away from the Imperial formation and moved toward the Allied lines. As it did, Imperial ships opened fire on their former ally, plasma bolts and particle beams converging on the defecting vessel. No trick, Chen realized. That's a real defection. Signal Captain Zektar that he has permission to join our formation and provide him with our current tactical frequencies. The defection of a single ship might have been a minor event in any other battle, but this was being broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. Within minutes, similar transmissions began arriving from across the Imperial fleet. Kethamori vessels that had been pressed into Imperial service abandoned their formations. Conquered species forced to serve in Imperial auxiliaries turned their guns on their masters. Even some Sekthara commanders, inspired by humanity's example, chose freedom over empire. High War Master Thekval watched his fleet begin to disintegrate with the horror of someone witnessing the collapse of everything they had believed in. The humans hadn't just resisted Imperial conquest. They had proven that the Empire's greatest strength, its ability to force others to serve, could become its greatest weakness when those others chose to stand up for themselves. "Sir, we've lost over 300 ships to defection," his aide reported. "The humans are broadcasting a general amnesty offer to any Imperial forces willing to join them." "Cowards and traitors," Thekval snarled, but the words rang hollow. He had served the Empire for 3 centuries, believing that their rule brought order and stability to the galaxy. Now he was watching proof that this order was built on fear, and that fear could be overcome by those willing to sacrifice for something greater. On the bridge of the Terra Invicta, Admiral Chen coordinated the most complex battle in galactic history. Her fleet now included ships from over 40 different species, many of whom had been fighting each other just hours before. The alliance that was forming in the heat of battle represented something entirely new. A civilization based on choice rather than conquest, cooperation rather than domination. "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, "the Imperial fleet is beginning to withdraw. They're pulling back to the outer system." Chen nodded, but she knew the battle was far from over. The remaining Imperial forces still outnumbered the Allies, and they were regrouping for what would likely be a final, desperate assault. But something fundamental had changed. The Empire's greatest weapon, the belief that resistance was futile, had been broken forever. Captain Zektar guided his scarred vessel into formation with human ships, still struggling to process the decision he had made. For 3,000 years, his people had believed that strength meant domination, that the natural order required the strong to rule the weak. The humans had shown him a different way. Strength could mean protection, and the greatest victory was not conquest but the freedom to choose one's own path. "Captain," his communications officer announced, "we're receiving personal messages from across the galaxy. Vorthak colonies are declaring independence. The home fleet is split between loyalists and rebels. Sir, the Empire is falling apart." The realization should have filled Zektar with despair, but instead, he felt something he had never experienced before. Hope. The galaxy was finally free to become something better than a collection of empires built on fear and subjugation. The final assault came 3 hours later, as the remaining Imperial forces launched everything they had at Earth itself. It was a desperate gambit designed to eliminate the source of the rebellion, even if it meant sacrificing the rest of the fleet. Waves of ships dove toward the blue planet, their crews accepting certain death if they could just silence the voice that had taught the galaxy to dream of freedom. But Earth was no longer alone. Ships from across the galaxy formed defensive rings around humanity's homeworld. Crews from dozens of species united by their refusal to let freedom die. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a statement of principle, that some things were worth protecting regardless of the cost. When the smoke cleared, both fleets had been decimated. But Earth still orbited its star, and the signals of free worlds continued to broadcast across the galaxy. The age of galactic empires was over, and something new was beginning. In the years that followed, the galaxy slowly transformed itself. The Free Worlds Alliance grew into a confederation of independent systems, bound together by mutual respect rather than imperial decree. Trade flowed freely between species that had never been allowed to interact under imperial rule. Scientific advances accelerated as knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. There were still conflicts, still struggles between those who sought freedom and those who preferred the old ways of dominance and submission. But the example of humanity had shown the galaxy something that could never be taken away: the knowledge that any being willing to fight for their principles could never truly be defeated. Admiral Chen, now aging but still sharp, stood in the memorial gardens on Luna, looking up at the stars where once mighty empires had given way to free peoples choosing their own destinies. The cost had been enormous. Billions had died in the wars of liberation that followed the Battle of Sol, but their sacrifice had purchased something invaluable: the right of every sentient being to determine their own fate among the stars. The galaxy would never again bow to fear, because humanity had taught them all that there was something stronger than any empire, more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any conquest: the simple refusal to kneel. And across the cosmos, on 1,000 different worlds, beings who had never heard of Earth told their children the same story: that freedom was possible for anyone brave enough to fight for it, and that even the most dangerous predators in the galaxy would eventually follow the lead of those who chose hope over fear. The age of humanity had begun not through conquest, but through the simple act of standing up and saying no, and the galaxy would never be the same.